Do you know what strength is? What makes heads turn and jaws drop and a voice from the back mumble, "That's a strong m-"? Is it carrying the farthest, throwing the highest, sprinting the fastest? If you want to dominate in a contest called World's Strongest Man, you need to do all of this and more. But if you want to walk into a platform and know the people watching are viscerally experiencing your performance as that of a strong man, the feat you perform needs to be relatable to them, intuitive. At the top of the short list of feats that meet that criteria is the overhead press. As long as strength has been useful to man, the hoisting of weight overhead has been one of the most immediate ways to influence how other people see you. Sounds silly, I know, but you won't really feel it until you've been in a circle of 20 men and seen how they respond when the biggest stone is lifted. Presidents and billionaires don't get that admiration. It's universal. Stones in ancient villages, barbells in the time of Sandow, women in the time of Swayze. And in all of sport, few others have tipped the scale past what we thought was possible than one Edward S. Hall.
Goodly! Fucking hell.
No, I'm not talking about the B-movie actor or the exhibition fighter. We're talking about the Eddie before that time, when he was on the competitive tear to manifest his dream of being the strongest man on earth. He's known for the first 1,100-pound pull, where a decade before, 1,000 was thought unreachable. You might associate his name with insane food intake and pushing to reach 440 pounds. His name might remind you of his feud with Thor, his social media antics in a Speedo.
Brother, what's that?
Or his perpetual trolling of Brian Shaw. Yes, this Mob Wars level 1 crook with his Florida public school haircut, bad tattoos, and perfectly placed eye scar has so much lore in the world of strength that many look past some of his most jaw-dropping moments. In my opinion, the ones that stand above all are his complete disrespect of gravity by effortlessly suspending weights as far away from the earth as his arms would reach. This video is going to be a rundown of Hall's most cartoonish demonstrations of power, along with the lessons we can take from his specific approach that got him there. This is how to press like Eddie Hall. Let's cover the feats of the British bloat lord, starting with benching. Bench pressing was a foundational lift for Eddie. He trained it aggressively, but never maxed out.
I used to train bench every week, super heavy for World's Strongest Man. For me, there was no reason to do a max bench, because training for the World's Strongest Man, if I tear a pec off, that's it, my career's over.
His best recorded lift was this 265 kilogram or 583 pound bench for 6 repetitions on an 8-foot whippy bar on a corporate bench setup with a pause. He estimated his max at this time would be in the mid to high 600 pound range and that he could push well into the 700s if it was a specific focus of his. When comparing this set of 600 pounds for 8 reps from Julius Maddox when he was on the warpath towards an 800 pound bench, I tend to believe Eddie on this. Now for overhead pressing, Eddie's reputation doesn't just come from winning events at the highest level. It's the way he did it. It seems to be a toss-up whether he chooses to use his legs, and his performances aren't obviously better when he does. In his first World's Strongest Man appearance in 2012, he strict pressed the Viking press in his qualifying group to win the event. This is against a field of the strongest men in the world who are allowed to push press and jerk. Every year, Eddie's placings at World's Strongest Man would improve until his ultimate win in 2017, which came a year after his historic 500 kilogram deadlift, where he was tipping the scales at 200 kilos, around 440 pounds. Eddie was at peak strength and in perfect position to do the impossible and push overhead press records in strongman to historic new heights, just like he did with the deadlift. Looking at the axle record, which in my opinion is artificially low because it just doesn't get tested as frequently. Deadlifts are a staple, they're always in, and they make you better at everything else in strongman, so there's a high incentive to be the best deadlifter you can, but big axles have fallen out of favor compared to log presses and circus dumbbells recently. In 2011, Zydrunas would set the standard for axle pressing in strongman with this 215 kilogram, which did not look limit by any stretch. Then Hall would come in 2017 and chip it by a single kilogram, which is ironic considering Eddie Hall fans take issue with the 1 kilogram jump that Thor used to break Eddie's record. Then in 2021, Iron Bibby would take the record by a kilogram, and then this year in 2024, Mitch Hooper would push it forward yet another single kilogram. Now it did take both Bibby and Mitch 2 attempts to hit the record, although Bibby strict pressed his good attempt and Mitch hit his with a shallow split jerk. But given over these 4 athletes that the record record is separated by only a kilogram each over more than a decade, there isn't a single doubt that Eddie could have set the bar so far out of reach that the event would have been retired for fear of the bicep tendons of future strongmen who might dare to chase it. His clean was the most efficient, his press was the most sure and effortless, but he didn't push the record forward, and that simply came down to how often the event itself was tested. You ever find yourself confused by the complexity of programming? I know I struggled like crazy in my early strongman career. There was just too much advice, and every decision I made felt like a guess. As soon as I hit a snag in any program, I would have no idea what to do, so I would inevitably bail. It took me years of training and coaching to figure out how to predictably increase muscle and strength, both in myself and others, and those lessons took me to my own showings in World's Strongest Man, America's Strongest Man, and the Arnold in the 231-pound weight class. This is why we made BaseStrengthAI, to give clear, direct, and personalized instruction right in the middle of your workout in real time. BaseStrengthAI features 3 programs: Block, 70s Powerlifter, and Bull Mastiff, each one inspired by the work ethic and programming of the biggest and strongest bodybuilders, powerlifters, and strongmen throughout history. These templates originated in my book Base Strength, and they can be ran as is, but with BaseStrengthAI, weight and volume are prescribed to you on your specific feedback, and that's personalization that even an online coach can't replicate. This gives you the absolute certainty that every rep is meaningful, that every block of training is getting you closer to your goals. It's my programming, but it's your program. Get the heart of old school training with the intelligence of a coach right in your back pocket. Head now to basestrength.com. The next year, in 2018, Eddie would take on Zydrunas' long-standing log record. Now, almost only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades, but Eddie's flirtation with that record indeed deserves special mention. Zydrunas' log record at the time was so impossibly higher than anybody else's that many thought it might be the unbeatable record in strongman. At the World Log Lift Championships, on Hall's second go-around with the 230-kilogram log, he cleaned it and pushed it 3/4 of the way to lockout with speed that suggested an easy gimme. Then at the top, at the strongest possible position, he stumbled, and the result was a no lift. Once again, we see raw strength and horsepower that is unparalleled in the entire field. But in this case, the training that yielded such strength also prevented him from having the specialized skill that most log pressers have. So let's break that down. Let's get into the training that allows somebody to manhandle 500 pounds this way in the first place, then talk about how it relates to your training. And more importantly, we want to ask, should he have done anything different? Now, you might look at one of the strongest men to have ever sauntered across a strongman stage and guess that they used highly specific strength protocols that were expertly crafted from years of scientific research to yield the most sport-specific results. And you would be wrong.
Good weight, sort of 5-6 reps. That'll be the strength building exercises. Then I always like to do mass building exercises as well. So get the blood through the muscle, get the stretch, rip all the fibers, and make sure I'm going away not only gaining strength but gaining size as well.
Eddie Hall is the epitome of a bro, but he's in good company. Eric Spada was a bench-only gym rat when he stole the raw record from Scott Mendelson, who is one of the most highly specialized benchers in the world. And many powerlifting records have been challenged and outright taken by bodybuilders. Stan Efferding had the all-time world record in his class for a time. Johnny Jackson deadlifted over 800 pounds in a contest while in a bodybuilding contest prep. These are not people who are paying attention to Prilipin's chart or carefully scheduling hyper-specific assistance work for stick points. These are people who train to get yoked. But there's a lesson here. With Eddie's training, we have to start with his bro split. Eddie Hall's split seems to have been consistent over his entire year, as it's been reported back to his first World's Strongest Man appearance, and you can see him follow it on the most recent YouTube videos. It's chest, back and abs, shoulders, bis and tris, and legs. This is as bro as it gets. It's a simple 1 time per week muscle group split that has been featured in some way in every bodybuilding rag since the days of Weider. Let's dig in. Now, the 1 time per week muscle group focused approach, notice we're focusing on muscles and not movements, is based on a high volume smash and recover approach. You're using a shit ton of sets and reps, a lot of fatigue techniques, a big surge of stimuli, and then following it up with the long recovery over an entire week before repeating the same workout. But the use of compound movements here, benching on chest day, overhead pressing on shoulder day, elbow extension on tricep day, makes it higher frequency than that. It's not quite the same as overhead press 3 times per week, but the muscles used are stressed more than that 1 time per week. So we can see that pressing had high priority in Eddie's training, more so than most strongman competitors who might only have 1 overhead press day out of the week because it just doesn't get rewarded that much in the sport. Now, using different movement patterns and emphasizing different muscles on each day means that you're going to sidestep likely overuse issues as if you were doing something like overhead 3 times per week. And you can put max effort on each workout to get a maximum stimulus because you are indeed rotating between a different emphasis each upper body pressing workout. Now, I also want to point out that it is a super well-rounded approach for developing the upper body to sustain big weights, and this is something that a lot of bodybuilders have in their corner ahead of a lot of powerlifters. Your typical powerlifter might bench throughout the week, following the timeless advice that you got to bench more to bench more, and many find that that works right until it doesn't. You get overuse issues, recovery issues, you might find lack of growth or response, and then juggling those multiple workouts actually gets kind of tricky. To get a big press, either a bench or overhead press, you need strong biceps, a big back, powerful triceps, filled out deltoids, and you might even need pec specific work. And just benching doesn't do that so well. The same principle applies to overhead pressing. So Eddie Split guaranteed that he developed the most overbuilt foundation for supporting the greatest possible poundages. His exercise selection was also super bro-ish. He would go big to small, compounds to little movements in isolation, bench to incline to machine to flies, and then barbell overhead to dumbbells to machines to raises. This is basic bodybuilding 101. His technical execution would also make modern exercise scientists nauseous, as he didn't always emphasize the stretch on his main movements. He would often stay mid-range and pulse his reps for his high repetition sets. He would take his seated presses to his chin, to his dumbbells, from his ears to just overhead, and he would save the stretch for smaller movements at the end of the workout. In the argument over range of motion for hypertrophy, examples of this type of execution abound at the upper levels. Yet, exercise scientists insist that a bigger stretch is superior all the way around. Now, from a strength perspective, more tension around the mid-range is going to yield more strength at the mid-range, and this often becomes a stick point for people that only experience the mid-range when momentum's on the bar after bursting through from a dead stop at the bottom. So it makes sense to have mixed ranges of motion, and I don't know why that wouldn't be the case with hypertrophy too. I'm inclined to believe whether you commit to one or use a blend of the two, your growth is really going to depend on your ability to progress it, not so much the magic of whatever execution you used through your training. But at the end of the day, we're left to guess, did Eddie get good in spite of his lack of full range of motion? Or was he good because of it? Now, one key takeaway from Eddie's training is that he continuously tried to make things disadvantaged. He would routinely talk about making changes to the exercises so that they would be harder and more strenuous, instead of what many strength athletes do and just trying to go for the biggest possible number in the strongest possible position. This is a theme with Eddie, not being attracted to hitting a PR at all cost. For instance, bench pressing, a staple movement for him and arguably the foundation of a lot of his overhead strength, he would routinely use an 8-foot wobbly bar with no optimized setup, no elbow wraps, and oftentimes paused. Now, this type of setup obviously limits the top weight that you're going to use. That could spare you from wear and tear over a long period of time, but the progression you make in weight over time is still going to represent the same proportionate increase in strength. And a big lift on this bar is likely going to translate to a much bigger lift on a more stable apparatus with a more optimized setup. Long story short, you can get nasty strong from training in the most disadvantaged positions. And if you only train in the most specific positions, you're going to miss out on a lot of easy growth and probably run yourself into the ground. Now, given Eddie's obvious influence from bodybuilding culture with his split and his exercise selection, it should be no surprise that his repetitions were also in the typical bodybuilding ranges that you might find in Arnold's Encyclopedia or in muscle magazines from the 1980s. Continuing on the theme of not putting pure strength work front and center, Eddie's reps were almost never done in the pure strength range of 3 reps or less. This is a departure from many strength athletes, especially amateur ones, where they are afraid of fatigue. There's this rationale where lifters will see their session the way a sprinter does, where like doing repeated 100-meter dashes doesn't make sense if you're fatigued because you're not going to be training top speed, so what's the point? Lifters don't want to come in under 100% capacity. They don't want to be limited by muscle soreness. They don't want to be fatigued from cardio. cardio, they don't want to be depleted from a caloric deficit, and that often leads a lot of lifters to not do the basic developmental work that's going to grow them in the first place. Eddie was not afraid of fatigue. Just the opposite. He knew firsthand that fatigue was huge in strongman. You were never fresh for an event. It was a brutal sport, and training to lift fresh was just going to shoot you in the foot. So he would intentionally gas himself out before going into big pressing sessions. Sets of 30 on dumbbell presses was routine before heavy overhead barbell pressing or log pressing. Even if you can argue that it's suboptimal in that session to build strength, the long-term benefit of not avoiding hard fatiguing work, allowing yourself to progress strength in those suboptimal conditions, led him to experience a net amount of stimulus that led to the acquisition of just stupid amounts of muscle and strength. There's a serious question here about how to balance broad developmental work with sport-specific work, but as far as the average trainee is concerned, I really think it boils down to delayed gratification. If you're not afraid to feel or look weak in a session, that allows you to do all kinds of work that are just undeniably effective for growth. Now, for Eddie's main work, he has said repeatedly that sixes were his bread and butter.
My rule of thumb is anything up to 6 reps, go up a weight. Anything below 6 reps, pat the weights away, move on.
And I've said in the past that sixes are the enlightened man's 5. That's why I based Bull Mastiff with the repeating sets of 6 off of Doug Young's progression, which followed the same principle. 6s and 5s represent an intersection of size development and strength development, where triples, doubles, and singles are the most specific for strength, but they're really shitty at making you bigger, and anything above 5 reps is going to be good for hypertrophy, but the further away you get from a 1 rep max, the less strength specific it is. Long story short, you get a lot of bang for the buck. That rep range does a lot. Rip was actually onto something. Eddie's workouts would involve doing 6s all the way up on a main lift until he hit the heaviest set of 6 that he could, and then he would progress the weight weekly until he could no longer do 6 reps, where he would drop the weight. And he seemed to be strict about this. He never let himself get out of that range. He didn't accidentally end up hitting 1 rep maxes when it was supposed to be a working set. Now, this is actually brilliant for a lot of reasons. Even though 6s aren't as neurologically strength specific as singles, doubles, and triples, it is a very marginal difference. 6s are still really good for strength. And if you were focusing just on those low rep ranges, you're going to see over time less mass grown, and also a lot more difficulty in programming. It's not viable to just progress low reps linearly indefinitely. They wear you down quick. The weight takes a toll on the joints, and your performance is more unpredictable, especially as you rack up the amount of fatigue necessary to actually cause growth in your body. So the extra programming wizardry that you see usually involves more elaborate cycling schemes or using some type of DUP, having heavier light days, and you have to keep track of them and juggle them. It's a lot more complex than just a simple easy peasy 1 time per week power building split, which is exactly what Eddie Hall ran. So we know what all this strategy did for him, but the question is, what did it cost him? Specialization is the big question here. All sports have to balance broad development that makes you generally better with the sport-specific work that specifically prepares you for the exact demands of the sport. Eddie's approach was hyper-focused on broad development singularly, and he rode that absolutely as far as it would take him. He obviously benefited from the faith he had in that style of training because he stuck to it so long, where so few people do. He had a consistent approach that he had on repeat for years, where so many will hop around to different programs and deal with constant FOMO every time they hit a snag in their training. But it doesn't change the fact that there was still an obvious hole in Eddie Hall's game. The impressiveness of his lifts come from his lack of technique. It's obvious that he's not exploiting the specific techniques that all of the other people need in order to hang at that level. He strict pressed world record weights when any of the other athletes could use their legs to push press or jerk. So the question is, what could a mass monster of strength like Eddie Hall have done with just a dash of practice using his legs? Even if we say forget that and allow Eddie to rely on his mutant strict pressing ability, he could have still clocked a lot more specific work with the implements right around contest time. Here's Eddie throwing around a 275-pound dumbbell. It's impressive by any standards, even the standards at World's Strongest Man. But when you consider what he strict presses in seated dumbbell presses, it shows that this is a huge weakness in skill that the other athletes who were more refined didn't have. Alexei Novikov absolutely murdered a 275 dumbbell like it was a paperweight at the Arnold, and you see how elegant his technique is, how specific and refined and explosive and deliberate. I guarantee you that Alexei at his best couldn't strict press within 100 pounds of what Eddie Hall could. And if you look at the lift that probably haunts Eddie Hall to this day, the missed log press world record, it is 100% from lack of practice. If Eddie would have taken a 4 or 5 month run leading up to this show, doing log twice per week, changing rep ranges, drilling speed, positioning, technique, putting his slow-mo sets of flies and raises on the back burner in favor of more specific work, he not only would have come in just as big and strong as he would have otherwise, but he would have had the leg drive, the speed, the coordination. He would have had the complete razor-sharp package that would have allowed him to set the record by probably another 20 pounds. But instead, he's famous for almost chipping the world record by a very small margin. We recognize his feats as being so insane because of the impressive display of his brute strength that supplemented the lack of technical refinement. And that should only remind you that you all will need to incorporate those more refined tactics that Eddie ignored if you want to be competitive. You can take a lot from his broad developmental work that made him so big, so strong, saved him from injuries that would have sidelined his career early. But you also need to know that in a sea of competitors, there's only one Eddie Hall. There's only one person that can rely on so much mass, making up for all of the other tools that allow people to excel. The lesson here is that your training can certainly benefit from what he did, but it can't quite be so one-dimensional. You could argue that his genetics allowed him to do just about anything and grow, but I really do see a thread here of consistent work in a deliberate range that allowed him to continuously benefit without falling apart, where so many other people get close to the sun and just absolutely disintegrate despite their talent. So that's why I think it's absolutely appropriate to use his approach as a model. So that's all I got for today, guys. Let me know what you think. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.